Chapter 17. Showing that an attack of rheumatism, in some cases, acts as a quickener to inventive genius. The constitution of Mr. Pickwick, though able to sustain a very considerable amount of exertion and fatigue, was not proof against such combination of attacks as he had undergone on the memorable night recorded in the last chapter. The process of being washed in the night air and rough-dried in a closet is as dangerous as it is peculiar. Mr. Pickwick was laid up with an attack of rheumatism. But although the bodily powers of the great man were thus impaired, his mental energies retained their pristine vigor. His spirits were elastic. His good humor was restored. Even the vexation consequent upon his recent adventure had vanished from his mind, and he could join in the hearty laughter which any allusion to it excited in Mr. Wardle, without anger and without embarrassment. Nay, more. During the 2 days Mr. Pickwick was confined to his bed, Sam was his constant attendant. On the first, he endeavored to amuse his master by anecdote and conversation. On the second, Mr. Pickwick demanded his writing desk and pen and ink, and was deeply engaged during the whole day. On the third, being able to sit up in his bedchamber, he dispatched his valet with a message to Mr. Wardle and Mr. Trundle, intimating that if they would take their wine there that evening, they would greatly oblige him. The invitation was most willingly accepted, and when they were seated over their wine, Mr. Pickwick, with sundry blushes, produced the following little tale as having been edited by himself during his recent indisposition, from his notes of Mr. Weller's unsophisticated recital. The Parish Clerk, a Tale of True Love. Once upon a time, in a very small country town, at a considerable distance from London, there lived a little man named Nathaniel Pipkin, who was the parish clerk of the little town, and lived in a little house in a little high street within 10 minutes' walk of the little church, and who was to be found every day from 9 till 4, teaching a little learning to the little boys. Nathaniel Pipkin was a harmless, inoffensive, good-natured being, with a turned-up nose and rather turned-in legs, a cast in his eye, and a halt in his gait. And he divided his time between the church and his school, verily believing that there existed not on the face of the earth so clever a man as the curate, so imposing an apartment as the vestry-room, or so well-ordered a seminary as his own. Once, and only once in his life, Nathaniel Pipkin had seen a bishop, a real bishop, with his arms in lawn sleeves and his head in a wig. He had seen him walk and heard him talk at a confirmation, on which momentous occasion Nathaniel Pipkin was so overcome with reverence and awe when the aforesaid bishop laid his hand on his head that he fainted right clean away and was borne out of church in the arms of the beadle. This was a great event, a tremendous era in Nathaniel Pipkin's life, and it was the only one that had ever occurred to ruffle the smooth current of his quiet existence, when happening one fine afternoon, in a fit of mental abstraction, to raise his eyes from the slate on which he was devising some tremendous problem in compound addition for an offending urchin to solve, they suddenly rested on the blooming countenance of Maria Lobbs, the only daughter of old Lobbs, the great saddler over the way. Now, the eyes of Mr. Pipkin had rested on the pretty face of Maria Lobbs many a time and oft before, at church and elsewhere. But the eyes of Maria Lobbs had never looked so bright, the cheeks of Maria Lobbs had never looked so ruddy, as upon this particular occasion. No wonder, then, that Nathaniel Pipkin was unable to take his eyes from the countenance of Miss Lobbs. No wonder that Miss Lobbs, finding herself stared at by a young man, withdrew her head from the window out of which she had been peeping, and shut the casement and pulled down the blind. No wonder that Nathaniel Pipkin, immediately thereafter, fell upon the young urchin who had previously offended, and cuffed and knocked him about, to his heart's content. All this was very natural, and there's nothing at all to wonder at about it. It is a matter of wonder, though, that any one of Mr. Nathaniel Pipkin's retiring disposition, nervous temperament, and most particularly diminutive income, should from this day forth have dared to aspire to the hand and heart of the only daughter of the fiery old Lobbs, of old Lobbs the great saddler, who could have bought up the whole village at one stroke of his pen and never felt the outlay. Old Lobbs, who was well known to have heaps of money invested in the bank at the nearest market town. Old Lobbs, who was reported to have countless and inexhaustible treasures, hoarded up in the little iron safe with the big keyhole over the chimney-piece in the back parlor. Old Lobbs, who it was well known on festive occasions garnished his board with a real silver teapot, cream ewer, and sugar basin, which was his wont, in the pride of his heart, to boast should be his daughter's property when she found a man to her mind. I repeat it, to be a matter of profound astonishment and immense wonder that Nathaniel Pipkin should have ever had the temerity to cast his eyes in this direction. But love is blind, and Nathaniel had a cast in his eye, and perhaps these two circumstances, taken together, prevented his seeing the matter in its proper light. Now, if old Lobbs had entertained the most remote or distant idea of the state of the affections of Nathaniel Pipkin, he would have just razed the schoolroom to the ground, or exterminated its master from the surface of the earth, or committed some other outrage and atrocity of an equally ferocious and violent description. For he was a terrible old fellow, was Lobbs, when his pride was injured or his blood was up. Swear! Such trains of oaths would come rolling and pealing over the way sometimes, when he was denouncing the idleness of the bony apprentice with the thin legs, that Nathaniel Pipkin would shake in his shoes with horror, and the hair of the pupil's head would stand on end with fright. Well, day after day, when school was over and the pupils gone, did Nathaniel Pipkin sit himself down at the front window, and while he was fain to be reading a book, throw sidelong glances over the way in search of the bright eyes of Maria Lobbs. And he hadn't sat there many days before the bright eyes appeared at an upper window, apparently deeply engaged in reading too. This was delightful and gladdening to the heart of Nathaniel Pipkin. It was something to sit there for hours together and look upon that pretty face when the eyes were cast down. But when Maria Lobbs began to raise her eyes from her book and dart their rays in the direction of Nathaniel Pipkin, his delight and admiration were perfectly boundless. At last, one day when he knew old Lobbs was out, Nathaniel Pipkin had the temerity to kiss his hand to Maria Lobbs. And Maria Lobbs, instead of shutting the window and pulling down the blind, kissed hers to him and smiled. Upon which Nathaniel Pipkin determined that, come what might, he would develop the state of his feelings without further delay. A prettier foot, a gayer heart, a more dimpled face, or a smarter form never bounded so lightly over the earth they graced as did those of Maria Lobbs, the old saddler's daughter. There was a roguish twinkle in her sparkling eyes that would have made its way to far less susceptible bosoms than that of Nathaniel Pipkin. And there was such a joyous sound in her merry laugh that the sternest misanthrope must have smiled to hear it. Even old Lobbs himself, in the very height of his ferocity, couldn't resist the coaxing of his pretty daughter, and when she and her cousin Kate, an arch, impudent-looking, bewitching little person, made a dead set upon the old man together, as, to say the truth, they very often did, he could have refused them nothing, even had they asked for a portion of the countless and inexhaustible treasures which were hidden from the light in the iron safe. Nathaniel Pipkin's heart beat high within him when he saw this enticing little couple come 100 yards before him one summer's evening in the very field in which he had many a time strolled about till night-time and pondered on the beauty of Maria Lobbs. But though he had often thought then how briskly he would walk up to meet Maria Lobbs and tell her of his passion if he could only meet her, he felt now that she was unexpectedly before him, all the blood in his body mounting to his face, manifestly to the great detriment of his legs, which, deprived of their usual portion, trembled beneath him. When they stopped to gather a hedge-flower or listen to a bird, Nathaniel Pipkin stopped too, and pretended to be absorbed in meditation, as indeed he really was, for he was thinking what on earth he should ever do when they turned back, as they inevitably must in time, and meet him face to face. But though he was afraid to make up to them, he couldn't bear to lose sight of them. So when they walked faster, he walked faster. When they lingered, he lingered. And when they stopped, he stopped. And so they might have gone on until the darkness prevented them, if Kate had not looked slyly back and encouragingly beckoned Nathaniel to advance. There was something in Kate's manner that was not to be resisted, and so Nathaniel Pipkin complied with the invitation, and after a great deal of blushing on his part and immoderate laughter on that of the wicked little cousin, Nathaniel Pipkin went down on his knees on the dewy grass and declared his resolution to remain there forever unless he were permitted to rise the accepted lover of Maria Lobbs. Upon this, the merry laughter of Maria Lobbs rang through the calm evening air, without seeming to disturb it, though it had such a pleasant sound. And the wicked little cousin laughed more immoderately than before, and Nathaniel Pipkin blushed deeper than ever. At length, Maria Lobbs, being more strenuously urged by the love-worn little man, turned away her head and whispered her cousin to say, or at all events Kate did say, that she felt much honored by Mr. Pipkin's addresses, that her hand and heart were at her father's disposal, but that nobody could be insensible to Mr. Pipkin's merits. As all this was said with much gravity, and as Nathaniel Pipkin walked home with Maria Lobbs, and struggled for a kiss at parting, he went to bed a happy man, and dreamed all night long of softening old Lobbs, opening the strong-box, and marrying Maria. The next day, Nathaniel Pipkin saw old Lobbs go out upon his old grey pony, and after a great many signs at the window from the wicked little cousin, the object and meaning of which he could by no means understand, the bony apprentice with the thin legs came over to say that his master wasn't coming home till night, and that the ladies expected Mr. Pipkin to tea at 6 o'clock precisely. How the lessons were got through the day, neither Nathaniel Pipkin nor his pupils knew any more than you do. But they were got through somehow, and, after the boys had gone, Nathaniel Pipkin took till full 6 o'clock to dress himself to his satisfaction. Not that it took long to select the garments he should wear, inasmuch as he had no choice about the matter, but the putting of them on to the best advantage, and the touching of them up previously, was a task of no inconsiderable difficulty or importance. There was a very snug little party, consisting of Maria Lobbs and her cousin Kate, and 3 or 4 romping, good-humored, rosy-cheeked girls. Nathaniel Pipkin had ocular demonstration of the fact that the rumors of old Lobbs's treasures were not exaggerated. There were the real solid silver teapot, cream ewer and sugar basin on the table, and real silver spoons to stir the tea with, and real china cups to drink it out of, and plates of the same to hold the cakes and toast in. The only eyesore in the whole place was another cousin of Maria Lobbs, and a brother of Kate, whom Maria Lobbs called Henry, and who seemed to keep Maria Lobbs all to himself, up in one corner of the table. It's a delightful thing to see affection in families, but it may be carried rather too far, and Nathaniel Pipkin could not help thinking that Maria Lobbs must be particularly fond of her relations if she paid as much attention to all of them as to this individual cousin. After tea, too, when the wicked little cousin proposed a game at Blind Man's Bluff, it somehow or other happened that Nathaniel Pipkin was nearly always blind, and whenever he laid his hand upon the male cousin, he was sure to find that Maria Lobbs was not far off. And though the wicked little cousin and the other girls pinched him, and pulled his hair, and pushed chairs in his way, and all sorts of things, Maria Lobbs never seemed to come near him at all. And once, Nathaniel Pipkin could have sworn he heard the sound of a kiss, followed by a faint remonstrance from Maria Lobbs, and a half-suppressed laugh from her female friends. All this was odd. Very odd. And there is no saying what Nathaniel Pipkin might or might not have done, in consequence, if his thoughts had not been suddenly directed into a new channel. The circumstance which directed his thoughts into a new channel was a loud knocking at the street door, and the person who made this loud knocking at the street door was no other than old Lobbs himself, who had unexpectedly returned and was hammering away like a coffin-maker, for he wanted his supper. The alarming intelligence was no sooner communicated by the bony apprentice with the thin legs than the girls tripped upstairs to Maria Lobbs's bedroom, and the male cousin and Nathaniel Pipkin were thrust into a couple of closets in the sitting room for want of any better places of concealment. And when Maria Lobbs and the wicked little cousin had stowed them away and put the room to rights, they opened the street door to old Lobbs, who had never left off knocking since he first began. Now, it did unfortunately happen that old Lobbs, being very hungry, was monstrous cross. Nathaniel Pipkin could hear him growling away like an old mastiff with a sore throat, and whenever the unfortunate apprentice with the thin legs came into the room, so surely did old Lobbs commence swearing at him in a most Saracenic and ferocious manner, though apparently with no other end or object than that of easing his bosom by the discharge of a few superfluous oaths. At length some supper, which had been warming up, was placed on the table, and then old Lobbs fell to, in regular style, and having made clear work of it in no time, kissed his daughter, and demanded his pipe. Nature had placed Nathaniel Pipkin's knees in very close juxtaposition, but when he heard old Lobbs demand his pipe, they knocked together as if they were going to reduce each other to powder, for, depending from a couple of hooks in the very closet in which he stood, was a large, brown-stemmed, silver-bowled pipe, which pipe he himself had seen in the mouth of old Lobbs regularly every afternoon and evening for the last 5 years. The two girls went downstairs for the pipe, and upstairs for the pipe, and everywhere but where they knew the pipe was, and old Lobbs stormed away meanwhile in the most wonderful manner. At length he thought of the closet, and walked up to it. It was of no use a little man like Nathaniel Pipkin pulling the door inwards, when a great strong fellow like old Lobbs was pulling it outwards. Old Lobbs gave it one tug, and open it flew, disclosing Nathaniel Pipkin standing bolt upright inside, and shaking with apprehension from head to foot. Bless us! What an appalling look old Lobbs gave him, as he dragged him out by the collar, and held him at arm's length. "Why, what the devil do you want here?" said old Lobbs in a fearful voice. Nathaniel Pipkin could make no reply, so old Lobbs shook him backwards and forwards for 2 or 3 minutes, by way of arranging his ideas for him. "What do you want here?" roared Lobbs. "I suppose you have come after my daughter now?" Old Lobbs merely said this as a sneer, for he did not believe that mortal presumption could have carried Nathaniel Pipkin so far. What was his indignation when that poor man replied, "Yes, I did, Mr. Lobbs. I did come after your daughter. I love her, Mr. Lobbs." "Why, you snivelling, wry-faced, puny villain!" gasped old Lobbs, paralyzed by the atrocious confession. "What do you mean by that? Say this to my face! Damn me, I'll throttle you!" It is by no means improbable that old Lobbs would have carried this threat into execution, in the excess of his rage, if his arm had not been stayed by a very unexpected apparition, to wit, the male cousin, who, stepping out of his closet, and walking up to old Lobbs, said, "I cannot allow this harmless person, sir, who has been asked here in some girlish frolic, to take upon himself, in a very noble manner, the fault, if fault it is, which I am guilty of, and am ready to avow. I love your daughter, sir, and I am here for the purpose of meeting her." Old Lobbs opened his eyes very wide at this, but not wider than Nathaniel Pipkin. "You did?" said Lobbs, at last finding breath to speak. "I did, and I forbade you this house long ago. You did, or I should not have been here clandestinely tonight." I am sorry to record it of old Lobbs, but I think he would have struck the cousin if his pretty daughter, with her bright eyes swimming in tears, had not clung to his arm. "Don't stop him, Maria," said the young man. "If he has the will to strike me, let him. I would not hurt a hair of his grey head for the riches of the world." The old man cast down his eyes at this reproof, and they met those of his daughter. I have hinted once or twice before that they were very bright eyes, and, though they were tearful now, their influence was by no means lessened. Old Lobbs turned his head away, as if to avoid being persuaded by them, when, as fortune would have it, he encountered the face of the wicked little cousin, who, half afraid for her brother, and half laughing at Nathaniel Pipkin, presented as bewitching an expression of countenance, with a touch of shyness in it too, as any man, old or young, need look upon. She drew her arm coaxingly through the old man's, and whispered something in his ear. And do what he would, Old Lobbs couldn't help breaking out in a smile, while a tear stole down his cheek at the same time. 5 minutes after this, the girls were brought down from the bedroom with a great deal of giggling and modesty, and while the young people were making themselves perfectly happy, Old Lobbs got down the pipe and smoked it, and it was a remarkable circumstance about that peculiar pipe of tobacco that it was the most soothing and delightful one he ever smoked. Nathaniel Pipkin thought it best to keep his own counsel, and by so doing gradually rose into high favor with Old Lobbs, who taught him to smoke in time, and they used to sit out in the garden on fine evenings, for many years afterwards, smoking and drinking in great state. He soon recovered the effects of his attachment, for we find his name in the parish register as a witness to the marriage of Maria Lobbs to her cousin, and it also appears, by reference to other documents, that on the night of the wedding he was incarcerated in the village cage for having, in a state of extreme intoxication, committed sundry excesses in the streets, in all of which he was aided and abetted by the bony apprentice with the thin legs. Chapter 18. Briefly illustrative of 2 points. First, the power of hysterics, and secondly, the force of circumstances. For 2 days after the breakfast at Mrs. Hunter's, the Pickwickians remained at Eatanswill, anxiously awaiting the arrival of some intelligence from their revered leader. Mr. Tupman and Mr. Snodgrass were once again left to their own means of amusement, for Mr. Winkle, in compliance with a most pressing invitation, continued to reside at Mr. Pott's house, and to devote his time to the companionship of his amiable lady. Nor was the occasional society of Mr. Pott himself wanting to complete their felicity. Deeply immersed in the intensity of his speculations for the public weal and the destruction of the independent, it was not the habit of that great man to descend from his mental pinnacle to the humble level of ordinary minds. On this occasion, however, and as if expressly in compliment to any follower of Mr. Pickwick's, he unbent, relaxed, stepped down from his pedestal, and walked upon the ground, benignly adapting his remarks to the comprehension of the herd, and seeming in outward form, if not in spirit, to be one of them. Such having been the demeanor of the celebrated public character towards Mr. Winkle, it will be readily imagined that considerable surprise was depicted on the countenance of the latter gentleman when, as he was sitting alone in the breakfast-room, the door was hastily thrown open, and as hastily closed, on the entrance of Mr. Pott, who, stalking majestically towards him, and thrusting aside his proffered hand, ground his teeth as if to put a sharper edge on what he was about to utter, and exclaimed in a saw-like voice, "Serpent!" "Sir?" exclaimed Mr. Winkle, starting from his chair. "Serpent, sir!" repeated Mr. Pott, raising his voice and then suddenly depressing it. "I said serpent, sir. Make the most of it." When you have parted with a man at 2 o'clock in the morning, on terms of the utmost good fellowship, and he meets you again at 9:30, and greets you as a serpent, it is not unreasonable to conclude that something of an unpleasant nature has occurred meanwhile. So Mr. Winkle thought. He returned Mr. Pott's gaze of stone, and in compliance with that gentleman's request, proceeded to make the most he could of the serpent. The most, however, was nothing at all. So, after a profound silence of some minutes' duration, he said, "Serpent, sir? Serpent, Mr. Pott? What can you mean, sir? This is pleasantry." "Pleasantry, sir?" exclaimed Pott, with a motion of the hand indicative of a strong desire to hurl the Britannia metal teapot at the head of his visitor. "Pleasantry, sir? But no, I will be calm. I will be calm, sir." In proof of his calmness, Mr. Pott flung himself into a chair and foamed at the mouth. "My dear sir," interposed Mr. Winkle. "Dear sir," replied Pott. "How dare you address me as dear sir, sir? How dare you look at me in the face and do it, sir?" "Well, sir, if you come to that," responded Mr. Winkle, "how dare you look at me in the face and call me a serpent, sir?" "Because you are one," replied Mr. Pott. "Prove it, sir," said Mr. Winkle warmly. Prove it. A malignant scowl passed over the profound face of the editor as he drew from his pocket the Independent of that morning, and laying his finger on a particular paragraph, threw the journal across the table to Mr. Winkle. That gentleman took it up, and read as follows. Our obscure and filthy contemporary, in some disgusting observations on the recent election for this borough, has presumed to violate the hallowed sanctity of private life, and to refer, in a manner not to be misunderstood, to the personal affairs of our late candidate. Aye, and notwithstanding his base defeat, we will add our future member, Mr. Fitzkin. What does our dastardly contemporary mean? What would the ruffian say if we, setting at naught, like him, the decencies of social intercourse, were to raise the curtain which happily conceals his private life from general ridicule, not to say from general execration? What if we were to point out, and comment on facts and circumstances, which are publicly notorious, and beheld by everyone but our mole-eyed contemporary? What if we were to print the following effusion, which we received while we were writing the commencement of this article, from a talented fellow townsman and correspondent? Lines to a Brass Pot. O pot, if you'd known how false she'd have grown when you heard the marriage bells tinkle, you'd have done then, I vow, what you cannot help now, and handed her over to What? Said Mr. Pot solemnly. What rhymes to tinkle, villain? What rhymes to tinkle? Said Mrs. Pot, whose entrance at the moment forestalled the reply. What rhymes to tinkle? Why, Winkle, I should conceive. Saying this, Mrs. Pot smiled sweetly on the disturbed Pickwickian, and extended her hand towards him. The agitated young man would have accepted it in his confusion, had not Pot indignantly interposed. Back, ma'am, back, said the editor. Take his hand before my very face. Mr. P., said his astonished lady. Wretched woman, look here, exclaimed the husband. Look here, ma'am. Lines to a brass pot. Brass pot, that's me, ma'am. Faults she'd have grown. That's you, ma'am. You. With this ebullition of rage, which was not unaccompanied with something like a tremble at the expression of his wife's face, Mr. Pot dashed the current number of the Eatanswill Independent at her feet. Upon my word, sir, said the astonished Mrs. Pot, stooping to pick up the paper. Upon my word, sir. Mr. Pot winced beneath the contemptuous gaze of his wife. He had made a desperate struggle to screw up his courage, but it was fast coming unscrewed again. There appears nothing very tremendous in this little sentence, upon my word, sir, when it comes to be read, but the tone of voice in which it was delivered, and the look that accompanied it, both seeming to bear reference to some revenge to be thereafter visited upon the head of Pot, produced their full effect upon him. The most unskilful observer could have detected in his troubled countenance a readiness to resign his Wellington boots to any efficient substitute who would have consented to stand in them at that moment. Mrs. Pot read the paragraph, uttered a loud shriek, and threw herself at full length on the hearthrug, screaming and tapping it with the heels of her shoes in a manner which could leave no doubt of the propriety of her feelings on the occasion. My dear, said the petrified Pot, I didn't say I believed it. But the unfortunate man's voice was drowned in the screaming of his partner. Mrs. Pot, let me entreat you, my dear ma'am, to compose yourself, said Mr. Winkle. But the shrieks and tappings were louder and more frequent than ever. My dear, said Mr. Pot, I'm very sorry. If you won't consider your own health, consider me, my dear. We shall have a crowd round the house. But the more strenuously Mr. Pot entreated, the more vehemently the screams poured forth. Very fortunately, however, attached to Mrs. Pot's person was a bodyguard of one, a young lady whose ostensible employment was to preside over her toilet, but who rendered herself useful in a variety of ways, and in none more so than in the particular department of constantly aiding and abetting her mistress in every wish and inclination opposed to the desires of the unhappy Pot. The screams reached this young lady's ear in due course, and brought her into the room with a speed which threatened to derange materially the very exquisite arrangement of her cap and ringlets. Oh, my dear, dear mistress! Exclaimed the bodyguard, kneeling frantically by the side of the prostrate Mrs. Pot. "Oh, my dear mistress, what is the matter?" "Your master, your brutal master," murmured the patient. Pot was evidently giving way. "It's a shame," said the bodyguard reproachfully. "I know he'll be the death of you, ma'am. Poor dear thing." He gave way more. The opposite party followed up the attack. "Oh, don't leave me, Godwin," murmured Mrs. Pot, clutching at the wrist of the said Goodwin with a hysteric jerk. "You're the only person that's kind to me, Goodwin." At this affecting appeal, Goodwin got up a little domestic tragedy of her own, and shed tears copiously. "Never, ma'am, never," said Goodwin. "Oh, sir, you should be careful, you should indeed. You don't know what a harm you may do, missus. You'll be sorry for it one day, I know. I've always said so." The unlucky Pot looked timidly on, but said nothing. "Goodwin," said Mrs. Pot, in a soft voice. "Ma'am," said Goodwin, "if you only knew how I have loved that man." "Don't distress yourself by recollecting it, ma'am," said the bodyguard. Pot looked very frightened. It was time to finish him. "And now," sobbed Mrs. Pot, "now, after all, to be treated in this way, to be reproached and insulted in the presence of a third party, and that third party almost a stranger. But I will not submit to it, Goodwin," continued Mrs. Pot, raising herself in the arms of her attendant. "My brother, the lieutenant, shall interfere. I'll be separated, Goodwin." "It would certainly serve him right, ma'am," said Goodwin. Whatever thoughts the threat of a separation might have awakened in Mr. Pot's mind, he forebore to give utterance to them, and contented himself by saying, with great humility, "My dear, will you hear me?" A fresh train of sobs was the only reply, as Mrs. Pot grew more hysterical, requested to be informed why she was ever born, and required sundry other pieces of information of a similar description. "My dear," remonstrated Mr. Pot, "do not give way to these sensitive feelings. I never believed that the paragraph had any foundation, my dear. Impossible. I was only angry, my dear, I may say outrageous, with the independent people for daring to insert it, that's all." Mr. Pot cast an imploring look at the innocent cause of the mischief, as if to entreat him to say nothing about the serpent. "And what steps, sir, do you mean to take to obtain redress?" inquired Mr. Winkle, gaining courage as he saw Pot losing it. "Oh, Goodwin," observed Mrs. Pot, "does he mean to horsewhip the editor of the Independent? Does he, Goodwin?" "Hush, hush, ma'am. Pray keep yourself quiet," replied the bodyguard. "I dare say he will, if you wish it, ma'am." "Certainly," said Pot, as his wife evinced decided symptoms of going off again. "Of course I shall." "When, Goodwin? When?" said Mrs. Pot, still undecided about the going off. "Immediately, of course," said Mr. Pot, "before the day is out." "Oh, Goodwin," resumed Mrs. Pot, "it's the only way of meeting the slander, and setting me right with the world." "Certainly, ma'am," replied Goodwin. "No man as is a man, ma'am, could refuse to do it." So the hysterics were still hovering about. Mr. Pot said once more that he would do it, but Mrs. Pot was so overcome at the bare idea of having ever been suspected that she was half a dozen times on the verge of a relapse, and most unquestionably would have gone off, had it not been for the indefatigable efforts of the assiduous Goodwin, and repeated entreaties for pardon from the conquered Pot. And, finally, when that unhappy individual had been frightened and snubbed down to his proper level, Mrs. Pot recovered, and they went to breakfast. "You will not allow this base newspaper slander to shorten your stay here, Mr. Winkle," said Mrs. Pot, smiling through the traces of her tears. "I hope not," said Mr. Pot, actuated, as he spoke, by a wish that his visitor would choke himself with the morsel of dry toast which he was raising to his lips at that moment, and so terminate his stay effectually. "I hope not." "You are very good," said Mr. Winkle, "but a letter has been received from Mr. Pickwick, so I learned by a note from Mr. Tupman, which was brought up to my bedroom door this morning, in which he requests us to join him at Bury today, and we are to leave by the coach at noon." "But you will come back?" said Mrs. Pot. "Oh, certainly," replied Mr. Winkle. "You are quite sure?" said Mrs. Pot, stealing a tender look at her visitor. "Quite," responded Mr. Winkle. The breakfast passed off in silence, for each member of the party was brooding over his or her own personal grievances. Mrs. Pott was regretting the loss of a beau, Mr. Pott his rash pledge to horsewhip the Independent, Mr. Winkle his having innocently placed himself in so awkward a situation. Noon approached, and after many adieus and promises to return, he tore himself away. "If he ever comes back, I'll poison him," thought Mr. Pott, as he turned into the little back office where he prepared his thunderbolts. "If I ever do come back and mix myself up with these people again," thought Mr. Winkle as he wended his way to the Peacock, "I shall deserve to be horsewhipped myself, that's all." His friends were ready, the coach was nearly so, and in half an hour they were proceeding on their journey along the road over which Mr. Pickwick and Sam had so recently travelled, and of which, as we have already said something, we do not feel called upon to extract Mr. Snodgrass's poetical and beautiful description. Mr. Weller was standing at the door of the Angel, ready to receive them, and by that gentleman they were ushered to the apartment of Mr. Pickwick, where, to the no small surprise of Mr. Winkle and Mr. Snodgrass, and the no small embarrassment of Mr. Tupman, they found old Wardle and Trundle. "How are you?" said the old man, grasping Mr. Tupman's hand. "Don't hang back or look sentimental about it. It can't be helped, old fellow. For her sake, I wish you'd had her. For your own, I'm very glad you have not. A young fellow like you will do better one of these days, eh?" With this consolation, Wardle slapped Mr. Tupman on the back, and laughed heartily. "Well, and how are you, my fine fellows?" said the old gentleman, shaking hands with Mr. Winkle and Mr. Snodgrass at the same time. "I have just been telling Pickwick that we must have you all down at Christmas. We're going to have a wedding, a real wedding this time." "A wedding?" exclaimed Mr. Snodgrass, turning very pale. "Yes, a wedding. But don't be frightened," said the good-humoured old man. "It's only Trundle there, and Bella." "Oh, is that all?" said Mr. Snodgrass, relieved from a painful doubt which had fallen heavily upon his breast. "Give you joy, sir. How is Joe?" "Very well," replied the old gentleman. "Sleepy as ever." "And your mother, and the clergyman, and all of them?" "Quite well." "Where," said Mr. Tupman, with an effort, "where is she, sir?" And he turned away his head, and covered his eyes with his hands. "She?" said the old gentleman, with a knowing shake of the head. "Do you mean my single relative, eh?" Mr. Tupman, by a nod, intimated that his question applied to the disappointed Rachel. "Oh, she's gone away," said the old gentleman. "She's living at a relation's, far enough off. She couldn't bear to see the girls, so I let her go. But come, here's the dinner. You must be hungry after your ride. I am, without any ride at all. So let us fall to." Ample justice was done to the meal, and when they were seated round the table, after it had been disposed of, Mr. Pickwick, to the intense horror and indignation of his followers, related the adventure he had undergone, and the success which had attended the base artifices of the diabolical Jingle. "And the attack of rheumatism which I caught in that garden," said Mr. Pickwick in conclusion, "renders me lame at this moment." "I, too, have had something of an adventure," said Mr. Winkle, with a smile, and at the request of Mr. Pickwick he detailed the malicious libel of the Eatanswill Independent, and the consequent excitement of their friend the editor. Mr. Pickwick's brow darkened during the recital. His friends observed it, and, when Mr. Winkle had concluded, maintained a profound silence. Mr. Pickwick struck the table emphatically with his clenched fist, and spoke as follows. "Is it not a wonderful circumstance," said Mr. Pickwick, "that we seem destined to enter no man's house without involving him in some degree of trouble? Does it not, I ask, bespeak the indiscretion, or worse than that, the blackness of heart, that I should say so, of my followers, that, beneath whatever roof they locate, they disturb the peace of mind and happiness of some confiding female? Is it not, I say—" Mr. Pickwick would in all probability have gone on for some time, had not the entrance of Sam, with a letter, caused him to break off in his eloquent discourse. He passed his handkerchief across his forehead, took off his spectacles, wiped them, and put them on again, and his voice had recovered its wonted softness of tone when he said, "What have you there, Sam?" "Called at the post office just now, and found this your letter, as has laid there for 2 days," replied Mr. Weller. "It's sealed with a wafer, and directed in a round hand." "I don't know this hand," said Mr. Pickwick, opening the letter. "Mercy on us! What's this? It must be a jest. It can't be true." "What's the matter?" was the general inquiry. "Nobody dead, is there?" said Wardle, alarmed at the horror in Mr. Pickwick's countenance. Mr. Pickwick made no reply, but, pushing the letter across the table, and desiring Mr. Tupman to read it aloud, fell back in the chair with a look of vacant astonishment, quite alarming to behold. Mr. Tupman, with a trembling voice, read the letter of which the following is a copy. Freeman's Court, Cornhill, August 28th, 1830. Bardell against Pickwick. Sir, having been instructed by Mrs. Martha Bardell to commence an action against you for a breach of promise of marriage, for which the plaintiff lays her damage at £1,500, we beg to inform you that a writ has been issued against you in this suit in the Court of Common Pleas, and request to know, by return of post, the name of your attorney in London, who will accept service thereof. We are, sir, your obedient servants, Dodson and Fogg. Mr. Samuel Pickwick. There was something so impressive in the mute astonishment with which each man regarded his neighbor, and every man regarded Mr. Pickwick, that all seemed afraid to speak. The silence was at length broken by Mr. Tupman. Dodson and Fogg, he repeated mechanically. Bardell and Pickwick, said Mr. Snodgrass, musing. Peace of mind and happiness of confiding females, murmured Mr. Winkle, with an air of abstraction. It's a conspiracy, said Mr. Pickwick, at length recovering the power of speech. A base conspiracy between these two grasping attorneys, Dodson and Fogg. Mrs. Bardell would never do it. She hasn't the heart to do it. She hasn't the case to do it. Ridiculous! Ridiculous! Of her heart, said Wardle with a smile, you should certainly be the best judge. I don't wish to discourage you, but I should certainly say that, of her case, Dodson and Fogg are far better judges than any of us can be. It's a vile attempt to extort money, said Mr. Pickwick. I hope it is, said Wardle with a short, dry cough. Who ever heard me address her in any way but that in which a lodger would address his landlady? Continued Mr. Pickwick, with great vehemence. Who ever saw me with her? Not my friends here. Except on one occasion, said Mr. Tupman. Mr. Pickwick changed colour. Ah, said Mr. Wardle. Well, that's important. There was nothing suspicious then, I suppose? Mr. Tupman glanced timidly at his leader. Why, said he, there was nothing suspicious, but I don't know how it happened, mind. She certainly was reclining in his arms. Gracious powers! Ejaculated Mr. Pickwick, as the recollection of the scene in question struck forcibly upon him. What a dreadful instance of the force of circumstances! So she was. And our friend was soothing her anguish, said Mr. Winkle, rather maliciously. So I was, said Mr. Pickwick. I won't deny it. So I was. Hullo, said Wardle. For a case in which there's nothing suspicious, this looks rather queer, eh, Pickwick? Ah, sly dog, sly dog. And he laughed till the glasses on the sideboard rang again. What a dreadful conjunction of appearances, exclaimed Mr. Pickwick, resting his chin upon his hands. Winkle, Tupman, I beg your pardon for the observations I made just now. We are all the victims of circumstances, and I the greatest. With this apology, Mr. Pickwick buried his head in his hands and ruminated, while Wardle measured out a regular circle of nods and winks, addressed to the other members of the company. I'll have it explained, though, said Mr. Pickwick, raising his head and hammering the table. I'll see this Dodson and Fogg. I'll go to London tomorrow. Not tomorrow, said Wardle. You're too lame. Well, next day, then. Next day is the 1st of September, and you're pledged to ride out with us as far as Sir Geoffrey Manning's grounds, at all events, and to meet us at lunch if you don't take the field. Well, then, the day after, said Mr. Pickwick. Thursday. Sam. Sir? Replied Mr. Weller. Take 2 places outside to London on Thursday morning for yourself and me. Very well, sir. Mr. Weller left the room and departed slowly on his errand, with his hands in his pocket and his eyes fixed on the ground. Rum feller, the Emperor, said Mr. Weller, as he walked slowly up the street. Think of his making up to that here Mrs. Bardell, with a little boy, too. Always the way with these here Eldon however, as the church study goes to look at. I didn't think he'd have done it, though. I didn't think he had done it. Moralizing in this strain, Mr. Samuel Weller bent his steps towards the booking office.